Thank you for joining us. I'm Gord Long. As always, it's my pleasure to have back with me this morning Charles Hugh Smith, well-known and prolific writer on the web, who is the publisher of the website of2minds.com. Good morning, Charles.
Good morning, Gordon. Always my pleasure to be on the program.
It's so how quickly the month goes by, as always, right? You're coming to us from Hawaii again.
Yes.
Have you got the seasons right? Shouldn't you be doing this? Anyway, I'm sure it's lovely all year round there.
I have a fall aloha shirt on. Okay, how's that?
Yeah, we're doing a podcast, so we're going to miss your shirt here today, which are always exciting. Charles, I want to jump right in and continue, because we're always short of time, from our discussion we had last month, which we called the Results of Financialization Part 1. This will be Part 2. And in Part 1, for those who don't remember or didn't hear the session, it's in our library at Macro Analytics. We discussed the current debt for equity swap underway, as well as the ramifications of zombie corporations, both a direct result of financialization of the economy. And following on regarding what financialization will mean, today I wanted to discuss whether we should expect the equity markets to possibly be nationalized during the next crisis. Because as we both acutely are aware, the rules always change during a crisis. I have here the agenda we both thought we would use in discussing this possibility. But any comments before we begin here this morning?
Well, Gordon, I think we should maybe start with our use of the word nationalized or nationalization. And what we mean is a modern version of the old use. In the old use, when something was nationalized, the central government took over the entire industry, owned it lock, stock, and barrel, right? Like when a country nationalized its oil industry, it took complete 100% ownership of that asset. What we're talking about is a much more sophisticated financialization mechanism in which the central government and the central bank take control of an asset that's considered private sector still. And my example is home mortgages. After the 2008-9 crisis, the government effectively nationalized the mortgage market in the U.S. 97% of all mortgages are guaranteed by a government agency. Only a handful of mortgages are actually private sector originated without federal guarantees of some kind. And so that's what we're talking about. And in the equity market, we see that state central banks and other government agencies are buying the equity markets directly. So they will control it by partial ownership and guarantees, not by buying the whole thing lock, stock, and barrel. So we have to understand the difference in this nationalization mechanism that we're discussing.
I'm right with you on this, Charles. The two words key here. Word nationalization you will probably never hear, never reference. It's something you'd only hear in us talking here this morning. The government will never use that word. The words you will hear and have been consistent is the word guarantees. And it's about guarantees, and it's through those guarantees they effectively have control. And whether they own it or not, it's irrelevant. It's dependent on those guarantees. And you know, we might need to remember the last crisis we had in 2008, the solution to be able to at least impede a collapsing, and we were very close to it going global very, very quickly, as Paulson and Bernanke headed up to Capitol Hill urgently, I recall one evening, because it was $5 trillion that could be exploded by the following morning as all money was being transferred. But it was through 12 facilities which were effectively guaranteed, where they went through the entire process, the money flow process at various areas, to be able to guarantee so that they didn't fall out. That's what you will see during the next crisis to ensure that we don't get this massive global contagion. And we need to remember, and you've written a fair bit about this, Charles, is that during crises that we become willing to accept things that otherwise we just wouldn't accept. We'll do anything to get the status quo. So as offensive as some of these comments may be to some of our listeners, that this would never happen, a few years ago, when we were talking about things, we didn't use the word quantitative easing and zero interest rate. People thought we were crazy, but that's what we saw. And you will see things like helicopter money. You will be amazed at what you will accept when crisis is all the way around you. Comments?
Well, Gordon, I think that's absolutely right. And here on your slide, you indicate that the 12 facilities in the last crisis are now viewed by central banks around the world as trial balloons. In other words, those guarantees worked, right? They, in terms of the saving the status quo, those were trial sort of tests of this whole system of guaranteeing and buying assets. And so now the authorities feel that this has been tested, the system works, and now they're just going to do more of that in the next crisis. And that's the topic of our discussion: what more means.
Right, like quantitative easing and ZIRP were trial experiments. Now they're considered status quo of standard monetary policy. Never, by the way, proven to be effective, and that's a whole discussion in itself. But one of the things, before we just get into some of these other trial balloons that have been going on to prepare us, in my mind, is a comment I'd like to make here on Stanley Fischer. And, Stanley Fischer is one of the most brilliant monetary minds in the world, who was brought in over 2 years ago with little fanfare as the co-chair of the Federal Reserve. And Janet Yellen gets all the press and the visibility, but the most brilliant mind on the Federal Reserve is Stanley Fischer. He was the professor for Summers, for Bernanke, etc. at his years at MIT, and he was former bank governor, head of the central bank for Israel, amongst many things that he's done. So the question is, what's he been doing for 2 years? His mandate that he was brought into, was market stability, to create systems and processes and assurance of market stability. The question I throw to our listeners is, you think he hasn't been extremely busy for 2 years? And if so, what's he been doing? And why would a man of this power and this stature be given such a major job? If they weren't concerned about the magnitude of the debt crisis that's clearly evident to everybody, and the size of it, and how that will evolve, and how we get through the eventual write down of that debt if we can't grow ourselves out of it. Any comments or observations you want to make on that, Charles?
Well, Gordon, I think you have a great follow-up slide here where the quote by Janet Yellen kind of raising the whole trial balloon of, gosh, the Federal Reserve is not permitted at this point in time to purchase equities, but hey, maybe that's a good idea, and if you guys want us to do that, then you'll have to authorize us to do that. And then another slide, you have a quote about the European Central Bank buying equities. And so this is evidence of exactly what you're describing, which is everything is we're being prepared. The ground is being plowed, the seeds are being tossed in. So when there's massive buying by central banks, it will all be considered normal. In other words, it will be normalized because it's been discussed, it's been the laws have been passed to inaugurate it, and so on. And we see this. If we think that this seems unrealistic, we should look at what Japan is doing. They've been in stagnation for 25 years, and so that's exactly what Japan has done. They've been buying bonds for decades. Now they've moved into equities and ETFs. And so that they've already plowed the ground, and everybody's looking at Japan is like, well, look how stable they are. They've succeeded. And so I just want to interject here. I don't want to disrupt our main narrative, but we have a couple slides here pointing out that what exactly is being saved when we say we're saving the status quo. And of course, to the average person, what's important is we're going to save pensions, right, which are based on usually on stocks and bonds and other financial assets. But what we're really saving is a system that generates tremendous inequality and wealth and income. In other words, the last 8 years of all these guarantees and quantitative easing have greatly increased the wealth and income inequality in the United States and in other developed countries and developing countries as well. I mean, China has an extremely high level of wealth and income inequality. So what we're saving is a system that is not really sustainable or fair. You know, it's not really providing widespread opportunity. It's actually concentrating wealth and power at the top of a pyramid. And so I just wanted to interject that. I don't want to disrupt the narrative, but we're saving a system that is not just unsustainable, but it's actually corrupt at its very core, because all the wealth and income that's being generated is going to the top 1% or 1/10%.
You brought out some of those points, a number of them in your recent paper you put out called "Upon the Next Crisis, the Rules Will Suddenly Change." Any other comments on that paper that really springboard from what we're talking about here?
Well, I think my main point is, and if I could get this across, I'd be very happy, is in the old days, the old model, we were distributing growth in the real economy by increasing productivity, which then increased wages, which then created higher standards of living for the bottom 80% or 90% of the households, and enabled them to acquire capital and a better life. Now what we're relying on is the expansion of asset valuations. We're not really creating any new goods and services. We're not boosting productivity. We're simply jacking up the value of certain assets, and that's what the whole system now relies on.
Precisely. I just did an interview here last week with USA Watchdog with Greg Hunter, and one of the things that I tried to argue was that we no longer have capitalism working in this country. I'm not trying to be negative. I'm just being factual. And it gets into what you just said, because when you have capitalism, and what capitalism is about investing in productive assets. So corporations invest in productive assets that in fact create profit. That profit, in other words, is savings. And that savings is then reinvested back into the corporations for more productivity and improvement. When you get increasing productivity in a nation, it then leads to higher standards of living. And that's what makes capitalism so successful. We no longer have that, whether by design or evolution. Because what we have now, one, the word savings, I might have to explain to people what savings is, because it's something that's been lost quite some times. Instead, today, what we have is we create credit. And with credit that is used for consumption. And consumption is exactly that. It's not investment. It's not wealth. It's consumed. And we're in a 70% consumption economy. So therefore, we're not creating the wealth, that the savings to create productivity, to create growth. And in fact, we have a serious growth problem. You wrote recently about Japan in a state of stagnation, and the United States possibly or globally starting to face that. It's my opinion, in a lot of my reading, that I believe that Japan, with as bad as their monetary policy and debt levels appear at a distance, actually has a strategy where it's no longer targeting economic growth. It sees stagnation globally, and what it's targeting is per capita income. That is a completely different strategy. And to manage per capita incomes, it means productivity, but it also means your ability to control your financial markets and the assets in it. And that's why, as we're going to get in, we're going to see the degree in which Japan, as one country, have already taken it, and I think that we will follow. I think the point we need to also make here, Charles, is why this would happen, why we would potentially see, to use this word, nationalization of the market. And it's because we have allowed, and if you look at the amount of leverage that we now have in the global economy, the charts I'm showing you are only the United States. The extended period of quantitative easing and zero interest rate has allowed the building of debt and leverage of that debt many times over, to the point that there's even insufficient collateral now to support through something called rehypothecation, the amount of debt that we have, or the amount of leverage that's built into the household, corporations, and financial institutions. And so any kind of correction in the equity market would bring on what I will refer to as a massive margin call. And if anybody's ever been involved in a margin call in something as simply in buying stocks, you know you get so many hours to post more cash or they sell the assets. And in this case, it isn't just stocks. It's global asset values that are so impaired right now because of the amount of leverage. And certainly the stock markets are there. So that's why the guarantees or the nationalization will be forced into this, because it would completely abruptly obliterate $400 trillion of pensions around the world, which would be a social nightmare of something that's unimaginable. So it's not like we're speculating here. They have little or no choice but to be able to react, or should be able, or must be able to react when we have the next crisis, assuming there's another financial crisis coming. Comments?
About the unsustainable leverage is lifting the asset valuations. And I think what we're trying to explain here is if we have a pension fund that's got $10 billion in it, and we need that to grow by a percentage every year, usually about 7 or 8%, in order to fund the retirees who will be drawing monthly checks from our pension fund. We need to grow that by 7, 8% a year, right? Well, how do we do that? Well, if we're not actually creating more value, then what we want, and the only solution to that is to increase the value of the stocks and bonds that our fund owns, right? And so what we do is, if by government guarantees and government purchases of these assets, they push the valuation higher. And so it's kind of creating money out of thin air, right? Because we haven't created any more productivity or more goods and services. We're just pushing the valuation higher. But that's saving our pension fund, right? Because we see our pension fund, and in terms of its net value, it keeps going up. Wow, the market's going higher. The stock market's going higher. Our pension fund is growing by $1 billion or $2 billion a year. Everything's rosy. So, but if those valuations fell, and we're talking about earnings per share or what the valuation is based on, if they fell to historic lows, which is based on profitability and other fundamentals, well, then our pension fund would only be worth $5 billion instead of $15 billion. And then we'd be unable to pay the retirees. And so that's really what we're talking about here, is now we rely totally on an expansion of these financial assets valuation to keep everything afloat. And so that's what you're saying, is if there was a market correction of the historic proportions, then the pension funds would be essentially insolvent, and that the taxpayers would be faced with a bill they couldn't possibly pay to recapitalize these failed pension funds.
One of the things with on this on leverage is the obvious part of the extent that we've taken it from to get this kind of performance. And so just some simple numbers. If let's assuming we're getting 2%, and you've got $100, so you've got to invest $100 and you're going to make $2. Well, that's not a very good return, and it's certainly not the way you're going to be funding pensions and corporations, etc. And it's even less than that. But if you can put in $20 of your money and borrow $80 of it at next to nothing interest, then what's your return? Well, your return is actually $2 on $20, which is 10% return. And what we've got today, Charles, with the amount of leverage that we have now built into the system, in many cases, we're lucky if we're putting in even the $2 and borrowing $98 to make these kinds of returns that people are after or demanding. I mean, the numbers have got so distorted. So that's great. But what it works in reverse when prices start to go down. It is just as bad, or collateral is impaired. And the charts, these two here, they're from Lance. They're, as I mentioned earlier, they're U.S. only. And and to put it into perspective globally, and I haven't seen any. If any of our listeners have seen them globally, the total leverage out there, I'd like you to send them to me. But I studied the Bank of International Settlements, numbers, and the central bank's combined asset holdings in major advanced economies, that is the U.S., Eurozone, Japan, have expanded by 8.3 trillion over the past 9 years, from 4.6 to just over 13 trillion. Yet, on the other hand, with these massive balance sheet expansions, we have little to show for it. We've only increased GDP by 2 trillion. So over 8 trillion only got us 2 trillion, which is the growth problem that I was alluding to earlier. We just don't have, the debt's not doing the job anymore. Ever mind the debt burning up the capital and wealth that we need to be reinvest. But a bigger point, and a point that Stephen Roach at Yale University is out on, he says, well, look, just subtract the two from the 8, you got $6 trillion of injected excess liquidity. And the difference between the growth in that's the difference between the growth in the central bank's assets and a nominal GDP. But that was not absorbed by the real economy and has instead, again, according to Stephen Roach, has been sloshing around the global financial markets, distorting asset prices across the entire risk spectrum. And that's $6 trillion that's not put in, is in the reserve bank reserve system, that can be out at 10 times that. And in some cases, like I just said, when they're leveraged up, it's even at a vastly larger than 10 times. So that 6 trillion could easily be 60 to 90 trillion dollars. I'm saying this, Charles, just so that everybody can get a perspective of the magnitude of leverage that's now sitting out there, all dependent on stock markets and bond prices. And a normal, correct, 1986, we had a 20% stock market correction in one day. So just think what that would do today. Now, I hope Stanley Fischer has got all the collars and everything in place, but I believe if we even got down around 8%, batten down the hatches, because it would be incredibly ugly. Comments on any of those numbers, Charles? Did they frighten you?
Well, they're almost incomprehensible. In other words,
precisely.
Yeah, it staggers the mind. I mean, there was just a report out that suggested that China's shadow banking, in other words, not the visible official banking sector, which has upwards of 30 trillion is in debt, most of which was created in the last decade. But the shadow banking system might be equivalent or even larger, pushing, the high 30 trillion. So you're talking about, in China alone, 60 to 80 trillion in debt. Much of it originated in the last decade. And we have to remember that the Chinese GDP is somewhere around 10 trillion, depending on how you want to measure it. So you're talking about debt levels that are, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times the GDP of these economies. And you have some great charts here that show the central bank balance sheets are lockstep with the world stock index. In other words, what we're describing is not like coincidence. It's like the central banks are buying assets and pushing the markets higher, right? And you have some great charts here that show central bank ownership of government bonds, of corporate bonds, and of equity. And you have a great chart here that shows that Japan, we were talking about as the leader of this policy, it went from owning zero of the Nikkei stock market to over 5% currently. And you say, well, what's 5%? But we have to remember Japan is the third largest economy in the world, behind the U.S. and China, and its market is huge. It's vast, and so for the central bank to be owning big chunks of equities and buying hand over fist, that's a major policy change.
Precisely. So a lot of what we're talking about in terms of government guarantees and controls are already kind of in place, and clearly in the bond market. And this chart here showing participation by the major central banks, we basically have taken control of the global bond market for all intents and purposes. And a point, just before I get into this detail of this, Charles, springing back to what you were saying, with China, which is a good example of the magnitude, as bad as it is of what's on balance sheet, and everything we're talking about and going forward is about what we see on balance sheet. What you should really be worried about is what's not on the balance sheet. And that is the leverage that's out there in all of these special purpose entities in the global swaps market, which is $500 trillion, and is in the shadow banking system. So when you start to get into the leverage that's in off balance sheet with no visibility over the counter, that's incredibly frustrating, or not, a worrisome fact. But I mentioned the bond market, this chart here. Without any recession or crisis, major central banks are purchasing currently more than $250 billion a month in government and private debt, which is primarily the ECB and the Bank of Japan. The Federal Reserve owns more than 14% of the U.S. total public debt right now. And the ECB and the Bank of Japan's balance sheet exceed 35 and 70% of their respective GDPs. I mean, these are staggering. The ECB owns 9.2% of the European corporate bond market already, and more than 10% of the main European countries' total sovereign debt. The Bank of England itself owns between 25 and 30% of the UK's sovereign debt. So they've become so dominant that there is no free bond market out there. I mean, it's very, very small. They totally dictate it. And so that's already in place. So we know that. The next issue then says, well, what's happening in the equity market? And this is back to our nationalization. And you mentioned just now about the Bank of Japan. And according to the studies I've looked at, they have 5% of the total Japanese market is now owned by the Bank of Japan. And that's growing at a significant rate. And they already, and the number that we have been watching, you and I know for quite some time, is the ETFs in Japan. Right now, the Bank of Japan now controls 75% or owns 75% of the total ETFs that are up there. These numbers are just staggering. And I'm just picking on Japan because they're the ones that are, they're right out, they're publishing all this data. We can see it. We don't know what other central banks are doing. I have up here this one on and I mentioned it earlier, the Swiss National Bank that's buying up around $85 trillion, that's plowing right into the U.S. stock market and keeping the FANGs and the NOSH and the main, it tracks perfectly with what they're buying, with what's going up on our index and what the total banks of central banks are increasing their balance sheet at and the rate that it's going up. So the central banks are already heavily involved in the markets, as call it trial balloons, but it's in reality. And China, you mentioned China, they have something called the national team, which is increasing holdings in basic security firms, the state-owned government entities that are buying other entities and investing in other entities to take more control and create more stability within their markets. And I haven't even got into things like the sovereign wealth funds, which are nothing more than government extended entities. The biggest one is the Norwegian sovereign wealth fund that I watch quite closely. We're talking $800 billion. They're talking 5 and 10% of the European stock market. So they're already there. Then we take out a lot of the various departments and agencies, various governments, not sovereign wealth fund. I'm showing a chart here of Japan, where the Japan Post is buying securities. And this is not uncommon. So the point I'm trying to make, Charles, is forget nationalization. That we're already in there effectively around the globe, if not guaranteeing, supporting and controlling the equity prices. If they fall, we have any kind of problem, the guarantees will be next because it's the next logical step. You disagree with anything there, Charles?
No, not at all. In fact, I would just emphasize that what we're talking about in the equity market, at least, and the bond market is an unspoken guarantee. In other words, we're seeing this coordinated effort by central banks and other central government agencies. And the goal here is to manage our perceptions of the stock market so that we know that if there's ever a crisis or any kind of serious decline, the central banks will jump in and buy whatever's needed to stabilize the market again. And so what this does is this management of our perception, that you can buy the dip safely because the central banks will always, have our backs and always save the day. It's a way of managing without having to actually own the entire market. In other words, the Federal Reserve doesn't have to print 20 trillion or 26 trillion, I believe, and buy the entire U.S. equities market. All they need to do is print a trillion or two, whatever's necessary, maybe another 4 trillion, and buy the dips. And then that trains all the private sector investors and pension funds to leave their money in there and not panic and not sell. And so you can see how they're guaranteeing the market stability without issuing a formal guarantee. And that's what we're talking about. They're guaranteeing it by being the buyer of last resort, buying the dips, and that's an effective guarantee of market stability. And that's what they want. And so far, they're getting it.
Very effectively, but very, very quietly. But I don't think, but quite obvious to those who are watching the markets closely. When this happens, the next stage, don't look, as we said right at the beginning, don't look for the words nationalization. Look for things like the Pension Guarantee and Market Stability Act. I don't know. Create your own fancy words, but it'll come out to be really reassuring and very logical. And Charles, this week I was reading a report by J.P. Morgan, and they were talking about the crisis they were referring to the crisis they're talking about. They're all talking about it coming. They just don't know when. They call it the Great Liquidity Crisis. That's what they're referring to it as, and it's basically my theme of a collapse in collateral values. But they're already in their report spelling out that it believes that it'll force the governments to come in with asset guarantees on a large scale, and they're speculating already on the size of those guarantees. So we're not way out in front of this one. I think that it's becoming pretty logical and pretty blatant what we're about to see. Have to wrap now, Charles. We're up against our hard line. Any closing comments you want to make?
Yeah, Gordon, I think my last point would be that once you start down this road, there's no way to get off of it. And I think we already see the evidence of that. In other words, for 8 years, central banks and agencies have been buying assets, right, as to control the markets. And you'd think after 8 years that the markets would be stabilized on their own and they could withdraw this purchasing. But we find that instead they're buying 200 plus billion a month still. Their run rate of 2 trillion a year of asset purchases to keep the system stable. So now that you've entered this path, there's no way off of it. And so you can think of it, and one way to think of it is we're flying into a box canyon. In other words, we're at 500 feet and the canyon walls are 2,000 feet, and there's no way out of this system now. And but it's ultimately not a stable system. Ultimately the governments and the central banks will have to own virtually the entire global stock and bond market to keep it afloat. And then you've lost the engine of wealth distribution and income distribution, and that's uncharted territory.
It doesn't mean the world's coming to an end, but it does mean the world, which has always been going through changes since man began walking the face of this earth. There's major changes that are going to happen in our lifetime. Some of them may be negative, but generally what always comes out of it at the end of the day is better things for mankind. So if you can know what's coming, you can prepare for it, not be frightened by it, invest properly and prudently. There's a lot of money to be made because it's not just wealth being destroyed. It's going to be a huge amount of wealth that's transferred, and it's already in the process, in my mind, currently being transferred. Charles, until next month, enjoy Hawaii. Will you be back in California for next month?
Yeah, I will.
Talk to you then.
Okay, thanks so much, Gordon.
Bye.
Bye-bye.